Bella. Okay, so welcome to Workers' Planet session about countering the far right and climate denial. Workers' Planet is a group of trade union and climate activists who want to respond to rising rents, insecure jobs, an accelerating climate crisis, and the rise of the far right. We've organized an event during the Trade Union Congress in Brighton last September to connect those struggles and ensuring trade unionism leads the way on. We believe that the climate crisis is a working class issue and more needs to be done to confront climate misinformation, meet workers where they are with political education, and build a visible alternative to the far right. We are hoping to organize the Workers' Planet event again at the TUC next September, and we'll be looking for volunteers to help us, so keep your eyes peeled. I also want to say well done to everybody who was at the mass demo on Saturday. Unfortunately, I couldn't make it, but it looks fantastic. But also, all of you who combat the far right in different ways at numerous counter-protests across the country, organizing in your community, or organizing to defeat racism and the hostile environment for migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees. The far right is growing across the world and in the UK. Whether it's reform or smaller fascist groups, they are a threat to migrants and racialized people. They are a threat to women and LGBT people, disabled people, and wider society. They are a threat to workers and their users. They are a threat to climate action. And we've seen the multiplication of climate denial discourses in their ranks. Whether it is reform councils dropping climate emergency declaration or the funding for renewables, or reform MPs being the mouthpiece for the fossil fuel industries, there are multi-layers on how they interact with the climate crisis. We've seen, for example, Andrea Jenkins, the reform mayor in Greater Lincolnshire, join Unite members on their picket line at the Lindsey oil refinery, or Richard Tice has been vocal about the job losses at Scunthorpe and Port Talbot Steelworks, pretending to be a friend of workers. So it's very concerning that some of the narrative unions like Unite or GMB have been pushing forward on oil and gas is somehow aligned with the drill baby drill message that we can hear with Trump and his supporters. So it's time really for climate activists to engage seriously in the movement to counter the far right, and for anti-far right protesters to pay attention to the climate justice dimension of that fight. I was at the COP protest in Manchester last November, where climate protesters, including children and family, were targeted by a large group of far right so-called auditors or YouTubers who monetize on hate. So tonight, it's the opening of a conversation about this. We've got some fantastic speakers who are going to share some of their thoughts, research, and practice to help us organize to counter the far right and climate denial. So I want to welcome Levy Gibbs from Hope Not Hate, who's going to speak about their new report, Reform in Power, in particular the climate dimension of it. Tyrone Scott from the Climate and Migrant Justice Organizing Group and head of campaign at War on Want. Ada, who is an independent researcher and co-author of Eco-Bordering Narrative on the British Far Right, who I hadn't seen before we started, so I hope you hear Ada. Jacob McLean from the Zetkin Collective, and last but not least, Ben Sellers from Democracy Collaborative and Durham Anti-Racist Activists. So all the speakers have got 5 to 7 minutes, and straight after hearing them, we'll move to breakout rooms so everybody can contribute, share their experience, and we'll finally come back together for the last part of the meeting to summarize our discussions and ideas, hopefully to highlight some next steps for us. And the session will finish by 8 p.m. So that's enough for me. And the first person to speak is going to be Levy. So Levy, I'll just pass the floor to you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and it's really good to see so many people here tonight. So as Clara said, I'm Livy. I work for Hope Not Hate, which is the UK's leading anti-fascist organisation. And Just for a bit of clarity, we class Reform UK as far right due to their divisive populist, anti-immigration and climate skeptic policies. And that last point is what I'm going to be speaking to today. So, as Clara alluded to, there's across multiple reform-led councils, we've seen a consistent shift with climate commitments being reduced, and in some case, even the scientific framing behind them being weakened or removed. So, in local government, we've just released a report called Reform in Power, which gives an overview of what reform have been up to since May 2025. So, nearly a year ago now, Reform UK took control of 9 county councils, including Kent, Durham, Lancashire, and Lincolnshire. And these councils, they make decisions affecting millions of people, including in areas already exposed to the risks brought on by climate change, so flooding and coastal erosion, amongst others. So they've inherited climate emergency declarations as councils, carbon reduction targets and action plans developed over several years. But within their first year in power, many of these have already been rolled back. So in Durham and Kent and Staffordshire, they've rescinded their climate emergency declarations already within a year. And Northamptonshire, as a council, has delayed its carbon neutrality timeline from 2030, which is where it was, to 2050. So they've pushed it back by 20 years, despite concerns that this could reduce confidence. Kent has also abandoned its net zero 2030 plan and replaced it with a more limited energy efficiency approach. And West Northamptonshire withdrew both its 2030 and 2045 targets. Lincolnshire has also replaced its Green Master Plan with a policy that rejects net zero as unachievable, and has also dropped its 2050 commitment. Staffordshire has removed long-term carbon targets from its strategy, and Lancashire ended voluntary carbon reporting. North Nottinghamshire has also voted against recommitting to carbon neutrality, and at the same time, oversight structures have been removed. Um, Derbyshire scrapped its climate committee shortly after taking office. Lincolnshire abolished its flood scrutiny committee, and Northamptonshire have dissolved an advisory panel that had been monitoring climate work across the area. So this all feels pretty bleak, and taken together, it's a clear pattern rather than kind of isolated decisions. We can see, yeah, a clear trajectory of what reform are doing when they get into power. So kind of a big aspect of this is changes to how climate is framed. It's not just these kind of targets, so 2030, 2045, that they're changing. It's a shift in how climate policy is justified. So earlier strategies referred directly to climate change, emissions, and the need to reduce them in kind of in administrations run by different parties, but in newer reform-led frameworks, this language itself is often reduced or missing. So in Lincolnshire, we see that the policy states that the climate is always changing without linking that to any anthropogenic, so human activity. And in Lancashire, councillors didn't support a statement recognising human-caused climate change at all. And we've seen extreme weather getting worse and worse. And in several councils, they've said that this is treated mainly as something to manage operationally rather than as a result of emissions that need to be reduced, which we obviously know the science doesn't back. So this affects how decisions are made because it directly weakens that link between the evidence and the policy. We've seen, as Clara alluded to in the intro, kind of really stark examples of climate denial within decision making. So in some cases, this is pretty explicit. In Kent, as a council, councillors voted to rescind the climate emergency declaration using a motion that called for scepticism towards human-caused climate change. And supporting material questioned the scientific consensus and also cited discredited resources. So if you dig into it, it's not factually based at all. In Nottinghamshire, a cabinet member described climate change as a hoax during council proceedings. And in Durham and Lincolnshire, councillors have downplayed the role of human activity in global warming. So there is clear evidence of climate denial within the Reform Party, and specifically when they get into places of power. Many of these changes they try to justify in terms of cost, but when you look closely, as I'm sure many of you know, the evidence for savings is pretty limited. So Lincolnshire dropped its carbon neutrality goal, citing cost, but the budget doesn't show clear savings at all. In fact, we know that reform-led councils have raised council tax, even though they said they wouldn't. In Kent, they claimed it would save £40 million by scrapping net zero plans, but a Freedom of Information request found no concrete evidence for those figures, and many of those projects haven't been approved or funded at all. In Durham, the council said it had freed up £20 million, but that reflects removing planned projects rather than generating actual savings, especially where funding would have come from central government. So it's not real-term savings at all. And at the same time, which I'm sure will be of interest to many people here, there is evidence that abandoning net zero could increase long-term costs, reduce investment, and really, really affect the job market. So the financial case is really not as clear as it's often presented by these people. And I think it's a real opportunity for us all to come in and push back against the idea that cost and climate action are somehow in conflict with each other. So there's a lot of information there to take in, but I guess just setting the scene, it shows a shift in how climate policy is being approached, and a little bit of foreshadowing if, God forbid, we come to see a reform government in Westminster in 2029. And in some cases, this already involves direct skepticism or denial, but in others, it's kind of more subtle. So removing the language and evidence that underpin the action. But both of these different approaches clearly reduce the likelihood of any meaningful climate policy being implemented at such a pivotal time that we are in now. And for people working in climate and in jobs affected by the climate crisis, this really matters for our day-to-day lives, because it affects whether local institutions are able or are willing to respond in a structural way. So I think it's really important that we link these kind of abstract policy decisions to people's real life experience and what that will mean for people in vulnerable areas and across the UK as a whole. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Livy. And yeah, I'm warning the speakers is that when I appear next to you, is that you need to like wrap down. But lots of really like concrete information, an example of, once reform is in power, what are they actually doing? We will circulate the link to the report so people can read by themselves, and also like a resource document with, local articles with examples that, will document that. So thanks so much, Livy, for your presentation. And I think the next person that is going to join us now is Tyrone Scott. I'm going to remove you and put Tyrone instead. Yeah, I mean, Tyrone, it's like really great to have you here. We know like the fantastic work that the Climate and Migrant Justice Organizing Group have been doing in, linking up climate, migrant, and racial justice organizations. So it's really great to have you here with us tonight. And the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Clara, and thanks for everyone here. So really nice to be here. So yeah, I am Tyrone Scott. I am head of campaigns at War on Want. I'm also part of, as you've heard, the Climate and Migrant Justice Organising Group, and also the Climate Justice Coalition. And I'll try and touch upon all three of those within the allotted time that we have. And yeah, also we have to reflect on just coming off the weekend. We were there organising as part of the Climate Justice Block on Saturday, and it was a really sort of powerful day, and it's perfect timing to have this call afterwards. So it's great to be in this space together, and yeah, it's fantastic as Saturday was. It's great to have a space straight afterwards to think about the organising and movement building we need moving forward. And I guess I just want to start by maybe being really clear about the moment we're in, and then touching on some of the work that we do. But as we've heard already, across the UK, globally as well, we're seeing this rise of the far right, and it's something that has been creeping for years, but it's really not something that's abstract anymore. And we see it showing up in our politics, in our media, and increasingly in our streets. And this is happening at the same time as a number of overlapping crises. Our cost of living crises, which has been increasing for years and pushing more and more people into hardship. Climate breakdown, which is already devastating lives. We know particularly in the global south, but increasingly here in the north, and the risk of that happening more and more, as we've just heard. Deepening inequality, where a tiny number of people are becoming even more unimaginably wealthy, while millions are struggling so much to get by. And in these moments, people are desperately looking for answers. They're asking, why is life getting harder, and why are things just not working? And instead of the truth being told, what we're seeing is the growth of this politics that's offering the wrong answers. It's what the far right doesn't specialize in, but increasingly it's what mainstream politics is doing. Scapegoating migrants and refugees, scapegoating the most marginalized and vulnerable members of our community, and doing anything to turn the eye away from the real culprits. And we're told repeatedly that migrants are the cause of the pressure on housing, public services, jobs, or somehow responsible for the multiple crises that people are feeling in their everyday lives. And we know that simply isn't true. We know the reality is that the problems we face today were not created by migrants or by other marginalized or vulnerable communities. They're created in a result of this, the system that's continuously put profit before people. And the people who benefit from and perpetuate this system are continuing to grow in more and more power. And this system has just let extreme wealth accumulate to unheard levels at the top. It's never been a good situation, but this has really sort of left the rest of society dealing with the consequences and turning, I guess, and increasing that division that's being stoked implicitly and purposefully by the architects behind the far right. And they know and we know that the problems arrive by private jet and super yacht, not by small yacht. And the heart of this is the increase in billionaire and corporate power. This system currently where a small number of people and corporations have just grown to have so much enormous influence over our economy, our politics, and in every aspect of our daily lives almost. And we can see that reality clearly here in the UK. While people are struggling with rising rents and bills and insecure work, billionaire wealth continues to grow. It was growing at the rate of £35 million a day the year before last, probably more last year. I don't have that number. I can't imagine it's gone down. And with this, communities are under so much pressure, and that wealth keeps increasing. And this isn't in any way a coincidence. It's a result of political choices that prioritize profit over people and protect that wealth over well-being. And there's a risk that if we do lurch further to the right, those political choices, well, there's no risk. They will just continue to get made. And with that increase in power, however, we're using that power being used to fuel division through media narratives, political messaging, this amplification of ideas that it's migrants, our communities, each other, that's to blame. And it's difficult to combat that narrative, of course. And sometimes it feels like we'll never win the media war. And that's why I feel it's so important to think about how we organize now in spaces and bring our conversation to people, because we know this division serves a fundamental purpose. It protects this system. If we're busy blaming each other, we're not challenging these structures that are actually driving inequality and crisis. And that's, I guess, exactly what we try and work, organize, and campaign around at War on Want is this fundamentally rigged system and challenging those structures that sit at the root of these crises. Trying to challenge this economic system that drives inequality, exploitation, war, climate breakdown, and also recognizing that this isn't something just that we see here in the UK. It's this global system where, the impacts are felt most sharply by communities across the South, where many of our partners are organizing every single day in the face of these same forces. And this is really the result of seeing this rise of the far right globally, in so many places where our partners and allies work. And, we are really in this campaign against the right with our comrades all across the world. And I think that's why it's so important that so much of our work is around genuine movement building, building connections across struggles, across borders, and supporting movements to come together to really challenge these systems collectively. Because I guess we know fundamentally that none of us can win in isolation, and we need this broader, more united movement. And hopefully I've got a little bit of time because I think I've been a while already. But a couple of initiatives, we've worked on just the last couple of years. Last year we played a big part in building the Make Them Pay coalition, trying to even with that piece of work, bring together different organizations, different constituencies around the climate injustice that is driven by billionaire and corporate wealth, the power that goes away from workers and to executives through the same system, and trying to build again across movements. And we know that if we need to change this system, we need to challenge that power directly. And alongside that, we've done a lot of work with the Climate and Migrant Justice Organising Group, which you've heard, which is within the Climate Justice Coalition. And it's because we know fundamentally there's no way to win, climate justice without migrant justice. It means we have to do that work to build real solidarity. It means supporting migrant communities who are facing attacks, and it means organizing locally in the face of this far right mobilization and challenging misinformation and the narratives that try and divide us. So yeah, maybe just to sum up because of time, but yeah, I think we all know on this call, but yeah, it's trying to widen that recognition that these struggles are deeply connected, and the same system that's driving climate breakdown is driving displacement, inequality, the hostile environment we see here. And when we talk about climate justice, it's not a single issue. It's climate breakdown is not something that happened by accident. It's a result of this system that was built on extraction, of resources, of labor, of land, at a time of people, all in the pursuit of profit. And it's the same system which is now fueling inequality and being defended by the politics of the far right. So that's why climate justice, means that we have to take on that system. And climate justice is fundamentally, is also about countering the far right, and these aren't separate. And we have to, take on the forces that are trying to protect this system. And as we see, reform growing in popularity, although some hopeful signs of some of this waning, but it shows us that people are looking for direction, looking for answers, and looking for a sense of belonging and purpose at this moment where things are all going wrong. And that is a fundamental fact, regardless of the ways, I guess, people are being led with their answers to this. So what can we offer in response? And, we need to try and not allow division to grow and see if we can build something stronger, and yeah, that's why I'm pleased to be part of this conversation today, and just the ongoing process of having more conversations and thinking, how can we get into communities and organize properly. Yeah, thank you. I look forward to the breakouts and the rest of the speakers.
Brilliant. Thanks so much. And I will encourage everybody to, go and check out the work that is done by the Climate and Migrant Justice Group. It's really fantastic. So thanks so much, Sharon, for all your thoughts and your experience and being here tonight. We're going to promptly move on to our next speaker. So Ada, I think I did see you. Ada, welcome for joining us. Ada is an independent researcher and co-author of Eco-Bordering Narrative and the British Far Right. Very interesting piece of research. I don't think many people have done so far, and really looking at different far right groups and what's the narrative. Look forward to hear from you, Ada. Thanks for joining us. The floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, Cara, and thank you for all the other presentations we've had so far. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the environmental politics of the far right beyond just the straight up climate denial. So this kind of started a few years ago where, or at least within the climate justice movement, there was sort of increasing talk about this idea of ecofascism and other potential eco-fascist futures, this kind of thing. And we're finding that a lot of the examples that we were coming across were from France and from the US. For example, back in 2019, there were two racist mass shootings in El Paso and one in Christchurch, from shooters who declared themselves to be eco-fascists, and were claiming that their actions were some form of environmental protection. So we started digging to see, is this a thing in the UK at the moment? Or maybe it's not. What kind of examples? What does it look like? So we joined some horrendous Telegram channels, and hopped on some fascist live streams, to try and get a handle of what was going on. So one thing we started to notice is that the far right isn't this. It's not this homogenous one single thing. There's diversity within it. And that's also the case when it comes to climate and to fossil fuels. So you definitely see with groups like Reform that they're really committed to climate denial. They love fossil fuels. They will put themselves on the line to defend burning fossil fuels. But as you drift more towards the fascists, it gets a little bit more complicated. So I'm going to mainly talk about two groups, one called Patriotic Alternative and another called the Homeland Party, which are kind of the two big players in British fascism at the moment. And in terms of their positions on climate change, both of them still deny that climate change caused by people is a thing. But they don't seem to care about fossil fuels to the same extent, right? They want energy security for the white nation, but they don't really mind whether it comes from fossil fuels or whether it comes from renewable energy. They want mobility, but they don't really mind if it comes from cars or whether it comes from public transport. But what makes them interesting to look at is that they still engage quite deeply with environmental politics. So last time I checked, Homeland had three flyers in circulation. They had one that was on immigration, one that was the Great Replacement Conspiracy, and a final one where they presented themselves as the real green solution and presented their fascist politics as the only true green politics. So to start to give you some examples of what this looks like, I'm going to share a couple of screenshots. These are from, I think it was 2022 COP that was hosted in Glasgow. And around that time, we had the Migration Watch UK, which is a right-wing think tank, I think run by someone in the House of Lords, that posted this forest fire hellscape with the words, "Mass migration puts pressure on our precious environment." Again, very clearly trying to use people's fear about climate change and blame it on migrants. We also saw the fascist group Patriarchy Alternative do this banner drop, where they claim reduce immigration to reduce CO2.
Ready?
Again, it doesn't seem like either of them are that fussed about climate change. They're still, Migration Watch UK are operating out of the same offices as the Net Zero Policy Foundation, the Global Warming Policy Foundation, right? So they're in bed with the climate deniers, but it doesn't change the fact they're very, very willing to use ecological politics to push an anti-migrant agenda. So moving on to Homeland, we've also seen Homeland blame river and sewage pollution on immigration. In part of their environmental policy, I think they claimed that the real reason there was all this sewage in the rivers was because there were just too many people and the infrastructure couldn't cope, which is very, very convenient for the colossal, the absolutely colossal private water companies that have pocketed billions of pounds whilst leaving the infrastructure to crumble. So I can move on and I can talk more about some of the kind of weirder elements of this, which once you get, this tends to be, the overpopulation stuff tends to be the more sort of front-facing the version of it. Once you get deeper into their own internal conversations, they start having these really bizarre conversations about blood and soil and how white British people have this magical connection to the British land and are the only people who can look after it. But that's only, which is kind of very Nazi adjacent type stuff. But I think really the point that I want to make is that, yes, a lot of elements of the far right are genuinely committed to climate denial. They're very, very committed to fossil fuels. But it's also really important that we recognize that the far right isn't just one thing, and that if we just focus on the climate denial aspect, we will miss the fact that the far right is also trying to greenwash mass deportation. And it's really, really important, I think, particularly people in the climate movement, to be aware of that and to fight that, and to be prepared to fight it and see it when it comes up and deal with it. So, kind of to finish up and emphasize that racism is a cause of ecological crisis. It is not a solution to the ecological crisis, whatever the far right is going to say. And what all this anti-migrant rhetoric does is ends up camouflaging the actual causes of climate breakdown, which are capitalism and which are imperialism. Deportation is not climate action. Population control is not climate action. Climate action means organizing our economy around sustainably meeting people's needs. So what does that look like? That means unconditional access to decent housing, public transport, energy access, food. We know that public provisioning of essential needs is far more sustainable, more effective, and less energy intensive way of doing it than private provisioning. It means scaling up those essential industries. It means scaling down industries that are much less necessary and destructive, like advertising, like SUV production, like weapons. It also means cutting the reckless energy consumption of the super rich, and it means ending complicity in US-led imperialism, which enforces unsustainable development on the rest of the world through debt, through sanctions, and through war. So this is what the far right do not want you to know. And we need to be doing what we can to fight these narratives, whether or not they are overt climate denial or trying to cloak themselves or greenwash themselves in supposed green politics. That is me done. Thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, Ada. That was like really interesting, and I do encourage people reading the article that will be shared in the resource document after the session. So yeah, lovely to have met you recently, since I was like researching this session, and I'm sure we'll be in touch. Our next speaker is Jacob. So Jacob McLean is from the Z King Collective. It's an eco-socialist group of scholars and activists working primarily on the political ecologies of the far right. And I think that's going to be upside down, but I came across them because I've started reading this White Skin, Black Fuel on the danger of fossil fascism. So I'm really pleased that, Jacob, you've been able to join us for this session. And I'm not sure which topic you're going to pick, but I think you're going to give us a bit more of a case study of some research you've been doing. So Jacob, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Clara. So today I'm actually going to very, very briefly introduce our new book, which is coming out in August. It's called The Great Driving Right Show, Cars, Crisis, and the Rise of Fossil Fascism. Forthcoming, as I said, in August with Verso Books, and I'll foreground a bit of the research, maybe most likely to interest the UK audience. So this project began almost 3 years ago and was initially sparked by a desire to understand the emergence of pro-car protest rallies in the UK throughout 2023. Think back to that time, a lot has happened since, but there were these large protests in Oxford against low traffic neighborhoods, 15-minute cities, as well as vandalism of bollards across the country, and the emergence of the so-called Blade Runners in London, who used long-handled secateurs to destroy ultra-low emission zone cameras. So the first output of this research into this was a short article that we published in 2024 with the journal Salvage, and you can find that online. But in the forthcoming book-length version, we're examining the rise of the far right and its battle against the green transition, focusing on movements and parties in European and North American context, but especially the UK, US, Canada, and Germany. And in particular, we focus on the far right's politicization of automobility and the internal combustion engine. So transportation, of course, is a leading source of emissions in many countries, and about half of total global oil consumption is accounted for by road transport alone. So it's quite logical that organized climate obstruction proceeds through a defense of this sector. So expanding on a periodization of denial that we introduced in White Skin, Black Fuel, which is the first book by the Z King Collective, co-authored with Andreas Malm, we posit in this new book that climate denial has entered a new late far right phase, which began during the pandemic and is accelerating in its wake. So organized denial emerged in the late 80s, sponsored primarily by fossil fuel and automobile companies who established think tanks, lobbying practices, and communication strategies designed to cast doubt on climate science and the need for mitigation. White skin, black fuel traced the emergence of a new far-right phase, beginning with Trump's first presidency, in which far-right parties became the most significant vectors for denial, coupling this denial with their trademark racism and ultranationalism. In the contemporary conjuncture, though, we find novel and interrelated processes that point towards the emergence of a new phase, this late far-right phase of denial. And each of these five intertwined processes or hallmarks are not reducible to denial or obstruction, but are crucial to understanding how it works today. So very, very briefly, these are: one, radicalization and mainstreaming, most notably through the concept and practice of remigration. Two, the rise of conspiracism. And we deploy this concept of the inverted crisis to understand conspiracism, according to which, at least in the eyes of the far right, the crisis is not climate change, but climate mitigation, which represents a supposedly existential threat to the rightful inhabitants of the West. And through various strategies of inversion, forms of denial directed at the climate crisis are stitched together with supposed crises of migration, race, gender, the family, and the nation. Third, the emergence of street-based protest has become integral to the overlapping repertoires of pro-fossil fuel and far-right movements. So that might be opposition to sustainable traffic schemes across Britain. It might be embedding anti-ecological demands under the aegis of the freedom movement against COVID restrictions. And there's other examples as well. Fourth, a generalized greenlash and subordination of climate in the hierarchy of crises. So from the pandemic, inflation, cost of living crisis, Israel's genocide in Palestine, the outbreak of wars in Europe and the Middle East, climate action is increasingly seen as a luxury we cannot afford and is subordinated in to these other crises. Fifth and finally, denial is further entrenched at the level of political economy. So renewables and sustainability commitments are abandoned as fossil capitalist super profits are reinvested into ever more production. Throughout the book, we theorize the inverted crisis in more detail. We offer political ecological history of the automobile industry. We take up several case studies. So these include the use of the internal combustion engine within protests, within right-wing populist protests, from the freedom movement and convoys against pandemic restrictions to the farmers' tractor protests against green reforms to European agricultural policy. And in another chapter, we examine Trump's return to the White House and his use of executive action to dismantle climate regulations and the nascent EV transition. And in a final chapter, we examine the expansion of militarization, the crisis of the German auto industry, and the environmental racism of the far right. The UK is the focus of the first empirical chapter, in which we look at mounting opposition to traffic reduction schemes from 2023 onward, which fused climate lockdown conspiracism with moral panics around climate protesters, traditional sex and gender roles, and migration. So in retrospect, these anti-lockdown movements and their pivot to climate, targeting 15-minute cities and the like, appears to have been a molecular form of the general rightward transformation of British politics occurring over the last several years. Both the Tories and Reform cheered on the upsurge of pro-car activism with Farage warning of impending climate lockdowns. But it was Reform that ultimately proved to be the beneficiary of this new street-level momentum, which would channel itself into anti-migrant demos and riots in the following years, including, of course, the massive United Kingdom demonstration in London. If COVID initially put migration on hold as the primary concern of far-right politics, swiveling instead to the mobility of the fossil nationalist subject, many of these same themes, however, would help pave the road back to xenophobic nativism, a far-right roundabout, we call it. So this roundabout corresponded with a broader shift occurring across Britain as this loose coalition of pro-car freedom activists circled back to anti-migrant politics, with these two issues, opposition to migration and climate policy, helping fuel this meteoric rise of reform. So organized denial, of course, has always been deeply enmeshed with automobility from the beginning, with auto companies like Chrysler, GM, and Ford joining oil companies as the main financiers of the earliest denialist organizations. But in and beyond the pandemic years, fossil-fueled automobility encountered its most serious threat yet, triggered by increased adoption of green urbanist policies, climate regulation, formal targets for combustion engine phase-outs, and the spectacular rise of Chinese dominance in clean tech and EVs. Thus, central to the late far-right phase is the so-called war on cars, a discursive framing that represents any initiative to challenge the internal combustion engine or reduce car dependency as a malicious attack on individual freedom. We find that the defense of individual automobility, moreover, is a cipher for a broader set of struggles, seemingly outside the traditional bounds of climate politics. Symbolically, effectively, and materially, the car is a vehicle for the far right, channeling apolitical investments in the status quo into reactionary forms of anti-ecological politics. Mobilizing online and in the streets, far-right actors are increasingly framing decarbonization measures as endangering individual liberty, the nuclear family, the nation, and Western civilization as we know it. So that's a high-level overview of this new project that's coming out, this new book that's coming out in August. And thanks so much. Really looking forward to the breakout discussions.
Thanks so much, Jacob. That's, an interesting, good to know more about the original book, but also like quite interesting case studies. And we can see how, the far right may seize particular issues to, instill their narrative. So thanks so much for your contribution. We've got our last speaker before we go to the breakout rooms. I'm really pleased that we've got Ben Seller with us, who is from Democracy Collaborative those days. He moves a lot around a lot, Ben, but also a Durham anti-racist activist. And I thought it was quite important that, we had a local campaigner in an area where, Durham has been taken as a county council by reform. So it's great to have you with us, Ben, and I'll leave you to get on with it.
Okay. I'm afraid I'm not going to cheer people up very much, because things are a bit grim in Durham too. I think we feel very much in the eye of the storm in terms of reform in particular. But just to give you a kind of quick background on Durham's anti-racist organising, really it's been about targeting pockets of quite sort of aggressive far-right activity, particularly in the southwest of the county, with the BNP and EDL organising hard for council seats. But we've always been really proud that we've managed to keep them out of any kind of power at all, not a single seat in that time. So, and then obviously in May 2025, that all changed. Reform took 65 out of the 98 seats in the in Durham County Council, described as a kind of political earthquake, and I think it was. But I think the main thing, really, I think people expected the Reform to win, but I think the sheer size of the majority in that landslide was quite scary. So the context also is a decline of the Labour Party in County Durham. So they lost 38 seats in that election alone, and just 4 remaining. So they only have 4 seats on the new council. And to put that in perspective, in 2013 they had 94 seats. So you can see the kind of turnaround. So I do want to say though, however, that the seeds of that change have been there for a long time, as other speakers have said, and we've seen it growing. We've seen the far right growing, and we've seen particularly far right narratives growing in County Durham communities, particularly in the former coalfield communities. So what have Reform been up to since they took power? Well, in some senses, not a lot. They have, in other senses, they have. What they've chosen to do is a lot of symbolic activity. So, and at the same time, there've been a lot of incompetence and inexperience and various scandals, which have seen resignations. But because of that huge majority, it hasn't really threatened their power. Recently, they cancelled a full council meeting because apparently there wasn't enough business to discuss. So that tells a story. But when they first achieved their power in the summer, before they'd even had their first full council meetings, the first thing that they did was to remove the pride flag outside County Hall, declaring that only national and local county flags will be allowed in the future. And Darren Grimes, who I'm sure you all have heard of, he's now deputy leader of Durham County Council. He defended the decision by saying it wasn't anti-gay, but it was anti-tokenism. And they also, at the same time, renamed several key departments to remove references to climate change and equality and inclusion. So very much sort of symbolic, kind of really symbolic gestures were very important to them. In July in 2025, the Reform Councils, as Libby already told us, voted to scrap the Council's climate emergency pledge to achieve net zero emissions by 2045. And the vote there was 62-7 to rescind that emergency declaration. And also during that debate, some of the councillors talked about climate change being a kind of pseudoscience. They significantly, I mean, on one level, they have been quite clever. So what they did was, at the same time as talking about climate change being a kind of pseudoscience, they also declared like an alternative emergency around SEND provision and care, and the critical and escalating crisis in children's social care in particular. So they're kind of pitting SEND provision against environmental breakdown, and I think they're quite. I think they're quite confident in that, and I think the polling has been done to show that reform voters believe just 1 in 3 believe in human-caused climate change, which is about half of the wider public, and they've gone further, in terms of the way they've talked about climate change. So they borrowed slogans from Trump. At a recent council meeting, Reform, a particularly sort of controversial councillor, Kyle Jenner, painted a picture of a dilapidated and deprived estates and joblessness and all of that sort of thing. And then talked about reindustrialization, including the extraction of coal, oil, and gas to make Durham great again. So this is their new slogan, "Make Durham Great Again." And he actually said, "I'm clearly not Donald Trump, but I do like the idea of drill, baby, drill. I do like the idea of jobs, babies, jobs." So it's pretty obvious stuff, but it's that this is the way they're kind of playing it. The In terms of kind of opposition, just to try and end on some sort of positive, because I think we've been in a bit of a difficult position in County Durham. We've had a really good tradition of anti-racist and anti-fascist organising, but just before Reform came to power, quite a lot of those structures fell apart for complicated reasons that I kind of can't go into here. But basically, some of that was about some of the political projects that people were involved in, and in a sense of demoralisation, and also I think some fatigue around the campaigning that had been done, and I think also that this is a really important point, that Reform a very different target from that aggressive kind of racist right that we'd seen in the past, particularly in the south of the county. So that is kind of, I feel that has been easier for us to organise against, and Reform have been a harder target. So the Stop Reform campaign during the local elections did not really take off in the same way. So. But having said that, at the first council meeting the second council meeting, there was a really vibrant and big demonstration outside of the council, outside of County Hall, with all sorts of groups, including anti-racist organisations, Palestine campaigners, climate change activists, LGBTQ activists, and trade unions. So that was a really positive start. And I think that what I haven't really got time to go into this, but I think I would be interested in following this up with people who are interested. We're also doing some stuff around the Miners Hall, Red Hills. I think people will probably know that place. It's a really important historic building, but also there's a Red Hills Foundation that has been set up, which is about community wealth building. So it's really about taking power in communities, workers' co-ops, looking at ways of using to oppose extractive kind of models of the economy, and things like community energy, mine water energy, and things like that. So there is also that very positive kind of coming together. I think it's still quite at an early stage, but we that alongside the getting together that anti-racist coalition again, I think does hold out a bit of hope.
Oh, thanks so much, Ben. It's like great to have a little bit more insight into, a local area. And, hopefully we're not going to see more reform councils being elected at local elections. And wherever they are, we need to organize to defeat them. So thanks so much for being here today. Right. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go straight into breakout rooms, because I realize, this is quite a lot of information and we want to give you a chance to be able to, share your own experiences. And we've got a few questions for the breakout rooms. Please do make sure that a couple of people may be designated to take notes of key points, be able to feedback or to send us some of the discussions that you're having in your breakout room. Please do keep your contribution brief, not like speeches, so as many people as possible can make that point. And we were planning 20 minutes in the breakout room, although that may be pushing it a little bit if we want to get some of the feedback. So I think I am going to cut that down to 15 minutes, I'm afraid, and ask people to come back at 22. You'll be coming back automatically into the rooms. We've got 3 questions or topics that we suggest you explore. You can share your experience of the far right in relation to climate issues, if you have any reflections or questions that were arising listening to the speakers, and more importantly, any idea of our next steps to counter the far right and climate denial. If we can come up with a couple of suggestions today about what we should do next, that would be absolutely fantastic. I will repost that into the announcement in the breakout, but I am now going to open all the rooms and let you go into your discussion spaces. I'm also going to allocate the speakers and moderators to different rooms. I should be the only person left in there. Okay, great. Hi, Ed. I don't know if you've just joined or if you cut out and I just rejoined, but people are in breakout rooms?
I cut out. It had sent me to the breakout room.
Okay, I will move you to breakout rooms then. Okay, I think you're going.